Some people don't come back to prove you wrong. They come back because they no longer care if you were right. Jason Miller's voice carried easily across the ballroom, smooth and practiced, the kind of confidence that came from years of being listened to, of being agreed with, of never being interrupted, and the laughter that followed rolled in waves beneath the warm amber lights, glasses clinking, shoulders leaning closer, people eager to be on the right side of the joke, and at the center of it all stood Emily Carter, still, composed, her fingers loosely wrapped around a half-full glass of sparkling water, condensation tracing a slow line down the side, untouched, as if time had decided to move differently for her than for everyone else in the room. Some lessons, Jason continued, lifting his drink slightly, a smirk settling in like it belonged there. You're grateful for, but you'd never repeat. More laughter, louder this time, sharper, someone muttering damn under their breath. Someone else glancing at Emily, then quickly away, because eye contact suddenly felt like participation, and the band in the corner didn't stop playing. But the music felt distant now, like it had stepped back to make room for the moment. And Emily didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink right away, her expression calm in a way that wasn't empty but controlled, like a surface of water that had long ago learned how to hold its shape even when stones were thrown, her dress simple, black, tailored, no sparkle, no excess, just clean lines that caught the light when she shifted her weight slightly from one heel to the other. And Jason's eyes flickered over her once, quick, dismissive, as if confirming something he already believed, as if she had remained exactly where he left her. And that was the part he needed everyone else to believe too, right, Emily? He added, almost casually, like an afterthought. But the room tightened around the question, subtle but real, a pause hidden beneath polite smiles and raised glasses, waiting for her to react, to defend, to justify, to give them something more to hold on to. And for a brief second, the only sound near her was the faint hum of the air conditioning above and the soft shift of fabric as someone beside her adjusted their stance. And then Emily did something small, almost forgettable. She set her glass down on the nearest table with precise care, aligning it with the edge as if it mattered, as if details still mattered. And when she finally looked up, her gaze didn't go to Jason first, it moved past him, just for a heartbeat, landing on the far wall where a polished plaque reflected the room in fragments of gold and shadow, a list of sponsors engraved in clean lettering, names that most people in the room recognized but didn't really understand, and her eyes rested there a second longer than necessary, long enough to register, long enough to remember, before she brought her attention back. And when she met Jason's eyes, there was no anger, no visible hurt, just something quieter, something steadier, something that didn't ask for permission to exist. And she gave a small nod, not agreement, not submission, just acknowledgement, like someone closing a chapter without needing to reread it. And then she turned, smooth, unhurried, the soft click of her heels barely audible against the carpet as she walked toward the exit, past clusters of people who instinctively made space without realizing why, conversations resuming in low, uncertain tones behind her, Jason's laughter picking up again, a little louder now, a little forced, as if filling a gap that had opened without his consent, and no one noticed. The way his eyes followed her for just a second longer than they should have, or the way his grip tightened slightly around his glass, because by then Emily had already reached the door, her hand resting briefly on the cool metal handle, her reflection faint in the polished surface, composed, distant, and for the first time that night, completely untouched. The door closed behind Emily with a softness that did not match the weight of what she had just left behind, and for a moment she stood still in the quiet hallway, the muffled laughter from inside fading into something distant and unimportant, like a memory that no longer asked to be held. The overhead lights cooler here, sharper, revealing details the ballroom had softened, the faint crease along her sleeve, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the way her hand lingered briefly at her side before she reached for her phone, not to call anyone, not to message, just to hold it, to feel something solid in her palm. And as she walked forward, her heels now echoing gently against the polished floor, her reflection followed her along the glass panels lining the corridor, each step measured, unhurried, as if she had already decided long before tonight how this moment would end. Outside the building the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain that had not yet fallen, and the city stretched out in front of her in quiet lines of light. Cars passing in slow intervals, their headlights brushing across her face for a second at a time before disappearing again, and she exhaled, not sharply, not dramatically, just a slow release, like setting something down that had been carried for too long, her gaze drifting upward for a moment before settling back at eye level, grounded, present, and then, without hesitation, she began walking down the sidewalk, away from the reunion, away from the version of herself that had once needed that room to understand her worth, the rhythm of her steps steady, almost rhythmic, like a metronome resetting time, and as she moved through the quiet block, a memory surfaced not as a flood but as fragments, small, precise, controlled, the kind that did not overwhelm but reminded. A kitchen with dim lighting, bills spread across the counter, her voice calm but tired as she reassured Jason that things would work out, his eyes already somewhere else, already calculating something she could not see, late nights where she stayed up working while he studied, the soft hum of a laptop in the dark, her hand reaching across the table only to find his missing. And then the day everything shifted, not loud, not explosive, just a sentence delivered too cleanly, too easily, as if it had been rehearsed, and the silence that followed had been heavier than any argument could have been. She did not slow her pace as the memory passed. She did not close her eyes or shake her head. She simply kept walking, letting it move through her like wind through an open space, because it no longer owned her. And when she reached the corner, she paused briefly, not out of uncertainty but intention, her eyes lifting to a building across the street, tall, glass, its name illuminated in clean white letters against the night sky. Hayes Group, the same name she had seen reflected earlier inside the ballroom, the same name etched into the polished plaque. And there was something in the way she looked at it now, not curiosity, not surprise, but recognition, like seeing a door she already knew how to open. A car passed behind her, its tires whispering against the pavement, and the light shifted again, catching the edge of her profile, highlighting the calm in her expression, the absence of urgency, and after a second, she continued forward, crossing the street with quiet confidence, the city unfolding around her not as a place she had to navigate, but as something she had already learned to move through, each step carrying her further from the noise behind her and closer to something that had been building long before tonight, something that did not need witnesses to exist. The building did not feel distant as Emily approached it. It felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with intention, the glass doors reflecting her back at her in sharper lines than before, her posture straight, her pace unchanged, and as they opened with a soft, controlled glide, the air inside shifted, cooler, quieter, the kind of silence that belonged to places where decisions were made without noise. The lobby stretched wide and clean, marble floors, catching the overhead lights in muted reflections, a receptionist glancing up briefly before offering a polite nod that did not question her presence, as if Emily belonged there in ways that did not need to be announced, and she walked through without slowing, her heels now softer against the polished surface, absorbed by the space rather than echoing through it, her gaze steady ahead, passing by a series of framed milestones along the wall, each one marking a year, a merger, a moment of growth. And for a brief second, her reflection aligned with them, not as a visitor, but as someone moving in parallel with their direction. And when she reached the elevators, she pressed a button without hesitation, the number lighting up instantly, the doors opening almost as if they had been waiting, and inside the elevator the mirrored walls surrounded her, not distorting but clarifying, every angle of her expression visible, every small shift in her breathing. And she did not look away. She met her own gaze directly, calm, composed, as if confirming something that no one else needed to hear. And as the doors closed, sealing off the outside world, the ascent began, smooth, quiet, the numbers rising one by one without pause. And with each floor the distance between who she had been and who she had become felt less like a gap and more like a transition she had already completed, the memory of the ballroom now reduced to something small, contained, almost irrelevant in the scale of what stood ahead. And when the elevator slowed, the soft chime marking its arrival, The doors opened onto a floor that carried a different kind of stillness, deeper, more deliberate, the kind that did not belong to routine but to authority. The hallway lined with glass offices and closed doors, each one holding conversations that shaped outcomes far beyond the room itself. And at the end of the corridor, a single office stood slightly apart, its door partially open, lights spilling out in a controlled line across the floor. And Emily walked toward it without breaking her pace, her presence quiet but undeniable. And as she reached the doorway, she did not knock. She simply paused, just long enough to be acknowledged. And inside, a man stood near the window, his back turned, the city lights stretching out behind him like a silent extension of everything he controlled, his posture relaxed but precise, as if every movement had been considered long before it happened. And without turning fully, he spoke, his voice even, measured, carrying across the room without effort. "I was wondering how long it would take you to walk in after walking out." And Emily stepped forward then, crossing the threshold without hesitation, her reflection briefly merging with the glass before settling into the space beside him. And when he finally turned, his expression did not shift in surprise or curiosity. It settled into recognition, calm and certain, like someone who had been expecting this exact moment long before it arrived. And Emily met his gaze the same way she had met her own in the elevator, steady, grounded. And for a second neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty but intentional, like a pause placed exactly where it belonged. And then she said, quietly but without doubt, "I did not come here to look back." And the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not a smile, not approval, just acknowledgement. And outside the window the city continued moving, unaware that something had just shifted, something that had nothing to do with noise and everything to do with control. The silence in the room did not break. It settled, deeper, more deliberate, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would not need volume to carry weight. And Alexander Hayes moved first, not toward her, but slightly to the side, one hand gesturing toward the chair across from his desk, an invitation without insistence. And Emily stepped forward, the soft sound of her heels absorbed into the thick carpet, her posture unchanged as she sat, her hands resting lightly together, not tense, not guarded, just present. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the city lights behind him stretching endlessly, reflections of movement without noise. And then he turned fully, leaning back just enough to study her without appearing to, his gaze steady, measured, the kind that had built empires by understanding what others overlooked. "You did not react," he said finally, not as a question, more as an observation placed carefully between them. And Emily did not look away, her voice calm, even. There was nothing there that required a response. And the corner of his expression shifted slightly again, something like recognition settling in, not of her words, but of the control behind them. And he nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming a calculation that had been running long before this moment. "Most people," he continued, his tone unchanged, "would have needed the room to understand them." And Emily's gaze did not move, but something in it sharpened, not defensively, not emotionally, just clarity. "I stopped needing that a long time ago," she replied. And the quiet that followed was different now, no longer a pause, but alignment, like two lines finally intersecting after moving in parallel. And Alexander stood then, walking toward the window, not turning his back completely, just shifting the angle of the conversation, his hands loosely in his pockets, his presence controlled without effort. "You saw the name tonight," he said, glancing briefly toward the reflection in the glass, not at her, but aware of where she stood in relation to everything around them. And Emily followed his movement with her eyes, not standing, not leaning forward, just tracking. "I have seen it before," she said, and there was no emphasis in her voice, no need to explain how or why, because the statement carried its own weight. And he let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh but never fully formed. "I know," he replied. And that was the first shift, subtle but undeniable. The acknowledgement that this meeting was not an introduction, not a coincidence, but a continuation. And when he turned back to face her fully, there was no curiosity left in his expression, only certainty. "You did not walk in here tonight because of him," he said, and Emily's gaze held his without hesitation. "No," she answered, I walked in because I was already on my way. And something in the room settled again. But this time it was not silence, it was agreement, and Alexander nodded once more, sharper now, more defined, as if a decision had just been confirmed, and he moved toward his desk, picking up a thin folder, placing it down in front of her without sliding it across, without pushing, just setting it there, an option, not an offer. And Emily looked at it briefly, not opening it yet, her fingers resting near its edge without touching, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, because whatever was inside did not surprise her. It only aligned with what she had already chosen, and outside the window the city continued its quiet motion, unaware that inside that room, something had shifted into place, something that had nothing to do with the past, and everything to do with what came next. Emily did not reach for the folder immediately, her gaze resting on it just long enough to acknowledge its presence without surrendering to curiosity, her fingers still, composed, as if the decision to open it had already been made long before it touched the surface of that desk. And Alexander did not rush her, did not explain, did not fill the space with unnecessary words, because whatever sat between them did not require persuasion, only timing. And after a quiet second, she lifted her hand and opened it with a controlled motion, the soft sound of paper shifting barely audible against the stillness of the room, her eyes moving across the first page, not scanning, not rushing, but absorbing, line by line, detail by detail, and nothing in her expression changed, not surprise, not satisfaction, just recognition, as if she was looking at something that confirmed what she had already calculated, projections, partnerships, strategic positions, and then a name, placed carefully within. The structure, Jason Miller, and the air in the room did not shift, but the weight of the moment did, subtle but undeniable, because this was not coincidence, this was design, and Emily's gaze paused there for a fraction longer before continuing, not lingering, not reacting, just noting, the same way she would note any other variable. And when she finally closed the folder, her hand rested on top of it briefly, grounding the decision before it became action, and Alexander watched without interruption, his posture unchanged, his attention precise, the kind that measured responses not by what was said, but by what was not. He is part of the expansion, he said, not as a reveal, but as context, and Emily lifted her eyes to meet his, steady, unshaken. I assumed that, she replied, her tone even, and there was no edge in her voice, no trace of personal weight, because whatever history existed between her and Jason no longer held authority in this room. It had been reduced to a detail within a larger system, and Alexander nodded once, slow, deliberate. Most people would ask why I included him, he added, and Emily's expression did not shift. Most people would still be thinking about him, she answered, and the silence that followed was not tension, it was alignment, a confirmation that both of them were operating on the same level, the same understanding of value, of distance, of control. And Alexander moved slightly then, resting one hand against the edge of the desk, his gaze narrowing just enough to sharpen his focus. This is not about proving anything, he said, and Emily's hand lifted from the folder, her fingers settling back into stillness. I know, she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that carried more weight than the words themselves, because it was not agreement, it was certainty, the kind that does not need reinforcement. And outside the window the city lights flickered in subtle patterns, movement without noise, and for a moment, both of them stood in that quiet understanding. Two people who did not need to explain ambition because they had already lived it. And then Emily stood, not abruptly, not as a reaction, but as a continuation, the motion smooth, deliberate, her posture unchanged as she faced him fully. When do we start? She asked, and it was not a question of readiness. It was a statement of direction, and Alexander's expression settled into something final, something decided. We already have, he said, and there was no dramatic shift in the room, no sudden change in light or sound, just the quiet confirmation that what had been set in motion would not reverse. And Emily gave a slight nod, not to him, not to the room, but to the moment itself, acknowledging its place in the path she had already chosen. And as she turned toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, the folder now left behind on the desk, It was clear that she had not taken anything from that room except what she had already brought with her, and that was more than enough. The hallway outside the office felt different now, not quieter but clearer, as if every step Emily took carried intention that no longer needed to be questioned. The soft hum of the building surrounding her without interruption, and as she moved toward the elevator, her reflection returned in the glass panels beside her, steady, aligned, unchanged from the woman who had walked in, but not the same as the one who had left the ballroom earlier that night. And when the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside without hesitation, pressing the button for the ground floor with the same calm precision. The descent smooth, uninterrupted, the numbers counting down. In silence, and she did not check her phone, did not look away. She simply stood there, grounded in the moment, as if time itself had adjusted to her pace rather than the other way around. And when the doors opened again, the lobby greeted her with the same controlled stillness, the receptionist offering a brief nod that carried recognition now, subtle but real, and Emily walked past without slowing. The glass doors parting for her as easily as they had before, the night air meeting her again. Cooler now, carrying the faint promise of rain that had still not arrived, and she stepped onto the sidewalk, her heels finding their rhythm against the pavement, steady, unhurried, as the city moved around her in quiet patterns of light and motion. And somewhere across town, in a high-rise office that did not carry the same weight of silence, Jason Miller leaned back in his chair, his tie loosened slightly, the glow of his computer screen reflecting against the glass behind him, his name now attached to a project he had been talking about for weeks, something bigger, something that felt like proof that everything had worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. His phone lighting up with messages, colleagues congratulating him, a few asking how he managed to get in on something tied to Hayes Group, and he smiled to himself, a small, satisfied curve that he did not question, because to him, it made sense. He had always believed he knew how to position himself in the right place at the right time, and he did not think about the reunion anymore. Not really, not beyond the echo of his own voice and the easy laughter that had followed, because in his mind, that moment had already been resolved, already placed in the past where it belonged, and he stood, walking toward the window, looking out over the city as if it belonged to him in some small way, his reflection merging with the lights outside, unaware of how incomplete that image truly was. And back on the street, Emily slowed for a brief second as she reached the corner, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, her gaze lifting once more toward the building she had just left, the name still illuminated in clean white letters, Hayes Group, and this time she did not pause to consider it. She did not measure its significance, because it had already become part of her direction, not a destination. And as she continued forward, the first drops of rain finally began to fall, light at first, barely noticeable, soft against the pavement, catching the glow of the streetlights in quiet reflections, and Emily did not rush, did not look for shelter. She simply kept walking, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, as the city adjusted around her, because for the first time in a long time, nothing behind her needed to be revisited, and nothing ahead of her needed to be rushed. Everything was already moving exactly where it needed to go. The rain did not last long, but the city carried its trace into the morning, a faint sheen across sidewalks, reflections stretching just slightly longer than usual under the early light. And by the time the sun rose above the glass edges of downtown, everything looked the same to anyone who had not been paying attention. But for Emily, the shift had already settled into something steady, something that did not need to be announced. Her morning began without urgency, the quiet rhythm of a small kitchen, the low hum of a coffee machine, sunlight slipping through the window in narrow lines that moved slowly across the counter, and she stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly against the edge, the other wrapped around a warm cup, her gaze directed outward but not searching, not waiting, just present. And when she moved, it was with the same precision she had carried the night before, opening her laptop, scanning through messages that had arrived. Overnight, most of them routine, a few marked with the name Hayes Group, flagged not by importance but by alignment, and she read them without reaction, her expression unchanged as she noted timelines, deliverables, decisions that needed to be made. And when she responded, her replies were short, direct, controlled, no extra words, no hesitation, just clarity, and across the city. Jason arrived at his office earlier than usual, his energy slightly sharper, driven by the quiet confidence that comes from believing momentum is finally on your side. The elevator ride up felt faster, the lobby greetings more familiar, as if success had already adjusted the way people saw him. And when he stepped into his office, the glass walls reflecting his movement from multiple angles, he placed his bag down with a sense of purpose, his phone already lighting up with another message. This one from a senior manager. A reminder about the upcoming strategy meeting tied to the new expansion, the one he had been talking about, the one that felt like the turning point. And he smiled again, not broadly, just enough to confirm to himself that everything was unfolding exactly as planned. He did not think about the variables beyond his view, did not consider the structure behind the opportunity, because from where he stood, it looked like a straight line, effort leading to reward, timing leading to success. And he adjusted his tie slightly, glancing at his reflection in the glass, a brief moment of self-assurance before turning back to his desk, unaware that the foundation beneath that moment had already been designed by someone who no longer needed to stand in the same room to shape the outcome. And back in her apartment, Emily closed her laptop, the soft click marking the end of one phase and the quiet beginning of another. She set her cup down, now empty, aligning it carefully near the sink. The same attention to detail she had shown the night before, not out of habit, but out of consistency. And as she stepped away, her phone vibrated once on the table, a single notification, not urgent, not loud, just present. And she picked it up, her eyes moving across the screen, a calendar. Confirmation, location pinned, time set, participants listed, and one name among them. Jason Miller. And there was no pause in her movement, no shift in her breathing. She simply locked the screen and placed the phone back down, her expression unchanged, because whatever that name once meant had already been redefined. And as she reached for her coat, slipping it on with the same calm precision, the morning outside waited without pressure, the city already in motion, unaware that somewhere within its structure, a meeting had been set that would not announce itself loudly, would not reveal its weight until it was already too late to ignore. And Emily stepped out, closing the door behind her with the same quiet certainty she had carried through every moment before, moving forward not to confront the past, but to stand exactly where the future had already placed her. The conference room carried a different kind of silence than the office the night before, wider, brighter, filled with natural light that filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows. But beneath that openness there was structure, expectation, the quiet tension of people who understood that decisions made in this space would ripple far beyond it. And one by one they took their seats, laptops opening, folders aligning neatly on the table, voices low and controlled as greetings passed between colleagues who had learned how to measure their presence. And Jason sat near the center, his posture confident, shoulders slightly back, the kind of positioning that suggested belonging without needing to claim it, his gaze moving across the room with familiarity, recognizing faces, acknowledging a few with brief nods, his attention settling on the presentation screen ahead, as if everything that mattered would unfold from there. And when the door opened again, the movement was subtle, almost easy to miss, but it shifted the room just enough, a pause in conversation, a slight adjustment in posture from those closest to the entrance. And Emily stepped in without announcement, her pace steady, her expression composed, the same calm precision she had carried through every moment before. And for a second no one spoke, not because they recognized her immediately, but because something in her presence did not ask for permission to exist. It simply aligned with the space, and she moved toward the table, not searching for a seat, but already knowing where she belonged, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair before she pulled it out and sat, placing her notebook down in front of her with quiet accuracy. And only then did Jason look up, his eyes catching her presence in a way that did not fully register. At first, a flicker of recognition delayed by expectation, because this was not where she was supposed to be, not in this room, not in this context. And his expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough to break the smooth confidence he had carried in, his brow tightening slightly, his posture adjusting by an inch as if recalibrating the reality in front of him. And Emily did not look at him, not immediately. Her attention directed toward the front of the room, her hands resting calmly Together, her breathing steady, and if she felt anything at that moment, it did not surface, it did not translate into movement, because this was not a return, it was continuation, and the meeting began without introduction, the lead strategist stepping forward, voice even, outlining the scope of the expansion, the numbers, the timelines, the stakes, each word landing with measured weight, and Jason leaned forward slightly, engaging, nodding at key points, his earlier confidence returning in pieces as he anchored himself in what he understood, the work, the structure, the process, and then the slide changed, a new heading appearing on the screen, strategic oversight, and beneath it, a name, Emily Carter, placed cleanly, undeniably, at the top, and the room did not react immediately, because recognition takes a second to move from sight to understanding, but Jason saw it at once, his eyes locking onto the letters as if they had shifted shape, his breath catching just slightly before he could control it, and slowly, almost involuntarily, he turned his head toward her, and this time, Emily met his gaze, not with challenge, not with satisfaction, just with the same quiet steadiness that had always been there. Only now it existed in a space where it could not be dismissed, could not be minimized, and she gave a small nod, not to him, but to the moment, acknowledging its place without claiming it, and then she looked forward again as if nothing had happened, as if everything had already been understood, and the meeting continued, the voices resuming, the discussion moving forward, but something in the room had shifted, something that no one named, but everyone felt, and Jason sat there, still, composed on the surface, but for the first time, the position he thought he held did not feel as solid as it had just moments before, and across the table, Emily remained exactly where she was meant to be, untouched by the shift she had just created, because for her, it was not a shift at all, it was simply alignment catching up to reality. The meeting did not end with a dramatic shift, it concluded the way most important things do, quietly, with chairs sliding back, laptops closing, conversations resuming in controlled tones as people gathered their materials and stepped out into the hallway carrying decisions that would unfold long after the room was empty. And Emily remained seated for a moment longer than the others, not out of hesitation but out of precision, allowing the space to clear without needing to move with it, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady ahead as if marking the exact point where one chapter ended and another continued without interruption. And across the room Jason stood more slowly than usual, his movements measured, not because he chose them that way, but because something inside him had shifted out of rhythm, his eyes returning to her once more, not with the ease of recognition from before, but with something quieter, something unsettled, as if he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. And Emily finally rose, gathering her notebook with the same calm precision, her posture unchanged as she turned toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, not avoiding him, not approaching him, simply moving forward along the path that had already been defined long before this moment. And as she reached the hallway, the light there softer, less direct, voices echoing faintly from nearby offices, she paused briefly, not to wait, not to think, but to allow the space behind her to settle completely. And that was when Jason spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy confidence it once carried. Emily. Just her name, nothing more, and it hung there between them, not demanding attention, but asking for it in a way he had never needed to before, and she stopped, not immediately, but after one more step, her hand resting lightly against the strap of her bag, her posture still facing forward, and for a second, the moment stretched, quiet, suspended, before she turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression composed, unchanged, the same calm that had carried her through every moment since the beginning. And Jason stepped closer, not too close, just enough to close the distance that once defined everything between them, his gaze searching her face for something familiar, something he could hold on to. "I did not know," he said, the words simple, incomplete, but heavy with everything he could not quite say. And Emily looked at him then, fully, her eyes steady, not cold, not warm, just clear, and in that clarity there was no accusation, no lingering pain, only distance, the kind that cannot be crossed by explanation, and she gave a slight nod, not in agreement, not in forgiveness, just acknowledgement of the statement as it existed, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, even, carrying no weight beyond its truth. You were not supposed to. And there was no edge to it, no attempt to correct him or elevate herself, just a simple alignment of reality. And Jason stood there, the space between them now defined not by what had happened, but by what no longer mattered. And for the first time, he did not have anything to add, no remark to fill the silence, no confidence to lean on, only the quiet understanding that whatever he thought he had left behind had moved on without him. And Emily held his gaze for one more second, just long enough to confirm that nothing else needed to be said, and then she turned, continuing down the hallway with the same steady rhythm, her steps fading into the soft hum of the building. And Jason remained where he was, watching as the distance grew, not dramatically, not suddenly, but inevitably, until she disappeared around the corner, and the hallway returned to its normal rhythm, voices passing, doors opening and closing, everything continuing as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing had, because for Emily, this was never about returning to a moment. It was about standing in a place where that moment no longer had any power. And as she stepped outside once more, the afternoon light softer now, the city moving in its usual patterns, she did not look back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left behind worth measuring against where she was going. And as she walked forward, her pace steady, her presence quiet but certain, it was clear that she had not come back to win him. She had come back because she had already won herself.